So a while back, I made the point that HIby was kind of the only digital audio player still making non-Android, cheap non-Android based audio players, but that's not actually true. There's a bunch of audio players out there from brands I haven't actually tried. So have I been missing out? Well, hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, we're gonna talk about this guy. This is the Surfans F28. It's a small digital audio player. It's not running Android, and it comes in at a price of 166 US bucks. Now, Surfans reached out to me, asked me to review this recently, but it looks like from what I can tell in the Amazon listing, this player's actually been around for a while. It came out in 2023, at least that was the first time it showed up on Amazon. And well, that might explain some of the things on this being a little bit out of date, but I'm still gonna give this thing a solid shot, and we're gonna talk about it because this thing has got balanced outputs, it's got a volume knob, and frankly, it's got a build quality that is quite nice. So, is it worth it? Well, let's dive in. I guess a quick shout out to Surfans for sending this in. If you want to check it out, of course, I'll have it linked in the description down below. You can find it. But let's talk about the build quality, physical form factor. Here's the packaging, nice, simple, small box. I dig that. No frills and not a lot of stuff inside of it, which is honestly fine. You get the digital audio player and you get a charging cable. The one thing that is kind of missing from this frame is that it actually did come with screen protectors, both front and back. So the back is made out of glass. It's not actually a screen, but it does come with a little plastic screen protector as well as one that's on the front. I took them off because they're just plastic screen protectors. And personally, I'm not a big fan of those. Like I want to touch glass, right? That's what the kids say online, touch glass. It feels better without this plastic screen protector, so I always take them off. But if you want it, there you go. Other than that, well, this thing is just here to hold to prop the player up, so that doesn't come inside the box, so that's what you get. Now, let's dive into the build quality on this thing, which is frankly, I would say my favorite part of the Surfans. The physical form factor on this thing is actually kind of fantastic. I think the size is just about perfect. In fact, let me, for comparison's sake, pull up an iPhone mini. So this is an iPhone 12 mini, just to give you a sense of how big the Surfans is, or rather, how small the Surfans is. I just think this is a really good size for an audio player. I think the thickness, all the dimensions are generally quite nice. And maybe even more so than that, I think the build quality, it actually feels really nice. Like it's got what feels like aluminum metal rails on the side, tops and bottoms, like you're just always touching nice materials, like I already mentioned. It's glass in the back, which is actually not my favorite material for the back of an audio player, but it is very common on audio players because it feels nice, and it absolutely does. And of course, you've got a big glass screen on the front of it. Other than that, I guess I'll make one complaint about the design of this thing, and that's the logo here in the front, this big white Surfans logo. I mean, it's not awful. I just think it would look better if it wasn't there. Or maybe if you want to take up this space with the logo, maybe do like an embossed logo where it's just still black with the rest of the metal. I think that would look a little bit sleeker and just draw more attention to the screen, which I think would look nicer. And then on the back here, you can see they've also got the logo again, as well as this slogan, which trust your choice and be your own fans. Maybe something good for us always to keep in mind. Apart from that, I think we can just talk about, oh, actually, one other thing I wanted to talk about, the form factor before we get into talking about the buttons and the I/O, is this LED. So there's a little blue LED on the side when this unit is powered on. And as far as I can tell, there's no way to turn it off. So if that is going to annoy you, if you're using this thing in bed at night, that is a little bit irritating. And there are a lot of audio players out there, again, the HIbys I was just talking about. For some reason, having a blue LED on is how you make a digital audio player. But at least with the HIbys, you can usually turn it off. Unfortunately, with this one, could not find a way. But okay, apart from that, let's talk about the screen quality real quick, which is, it's not great. You can see the resolution is pretty low, and so because of that, things end up being quite tall, or just generally quite large. That said, though, I don't know, it's perfectly readable. The other thing too is just that the viewing angles are not great. You can see that the contrast drops quite a bit when you tilt it to different angles. It's perfectly usable. I'll be honest, don't really have any complaints in terms of the actual usability of it. But if you're looking for something that just feels premium and a little bit nicer, I don't think the screen is up to snuff with the rest of the build quality. Okay, let's talk about the buttons, which is frankly like one of the main reasons I like to have a digital audio player. Is I like having physical buttons that I can use, that I can, have the screen turned off, have this thing sitting in my pocket or sitting next to me on the couch and reach over and use it without having to look at it. That for me is like half the value, if not more, for a digital audio player. And this one, obviously, it's got buttons, and it's got all the buttons you would want. In fact, I actually really like the buttons here on the F28. Let's zoom in and take a look at what we have. So we have a power on-off button, which also toggles the screen on and off. You can press and hold it to power the unit entirely off if you'd like. And then you've also got a play pause button in the center, as well as previous track and next track buttons up and down. And generally I find this button layout actually quite nice because there is a nice gap here between the power button and these three buttons. It's easy to tell when my finger is over this button versus these ones. And then because of this, three button orientation, it's very easy to tell which button my fingers are over. So generally I like the button configuration of this thing. It's actually pretty nice. The other thing that is we haven't talked about, right, because there's no volume buttons over here, is this knob, because all the volume is controlled with this knob. Now, I am kind of still of two minds when it comes to volume knobs for digital audio players. I think the plus side is that knobs just feel cool. I like a knob. This is my preferred way to control volume generally. And generally the control in this is nice. It is still a digital control, as you can probably maybe hear. But that's pretty typical. The potential downside of a volume knob on an audio player like this is if you put it in your pocket, you might accidentally bump this in a way that a more traditional micro switch button is less likely to be pressed. So, but that said, I didn't really have issues with it. I think that the way that this thing is kind of molded into the shape of the player itself generally avoids that issue while still giving you actually pretty good control over the knob. So I like that. Now, actually two small complaints here with the volume knob. Complaint number one is just that it spins the wrong way. And maybe this is a personal choice. I'm actually kind of curious for feedback from other people. But I expect that clockwise turns the volume up. But you can notice that I'm turning it clockwise and the volume is going down. And then vice versa, going counterclockwise is how I turn the volume up, which feels unintuitive to me. I feel like I spin it the wrong way every time. What's interesting is I have noticed on some other players that have volume knobs, sometimes they'll even give you the option to change it to spin the other way. So maybe there is like a cohort of people out there that like it to go that direction, but personally I prefer the other. I prefer clockwise to be volume up, and there's no option to turn that on. So yeah, small complaint. The bigger issue I had, and you might have even noticed it happening while I'm doing this, is that while I'm changing the volume, basically the palm of my hand is touching the screen, and it makes the display of the volume go away, which just makes this kind of feel a little glitchy and janky. I actually thought that it was like a software bug initially until I realized, oh, it only actually does it when I'm holding it in my hand the way I just was, right? Interesting. So something to keep in mind. I actually just noticed too, it's like warning me about going over 50% volume, but I think it only does that once you power it on. Anyway, okay, enough about the volume knob and the buttons. Generally quite good, a couple of small complaints, but I don't know, I'm pretty happy with that stuff. The other stuff is the I/O, and this is where we're gonna get into potential deal breaker, I think, for a lot of people, but I'm gonna hold off on that for a little bit. So down here in the bottom, you've got USB-C for charging. As well, you can connect this thing to a computer and use it as an external DAC amp, which I think is kind of cool. And then you've got, of course, your micro SD card slot where you can connect it to or plug in a memory card to increase the memory. Here's where we've got a little bit of a problem. Actually, maybe two problems. The problem for me is just I prefer to have my headphone jacks on the bottom of my audio player rather than on the top. Again, it's kind of a small complaint. I could overlook that. But the one that I have a feeling is going to be unforgivable for a lot of people is that the balance connector. So it does have single-ended balance, but the balance connector is a 2.5 millimeter balance. You remember those? I mentioned this thing's a couple of years old and might feel a little outdated in some ways. This is one of those ways. This is maybe the main way that this thing feels pretty outdated. I have not seen a 2.5 millimeter balance connector on a DAP in a couple of years. And frankly, most people have just kind of moved on to 4.4 mil. As someone who doesn't really use balance connectors that often, it doesn't bother me too much, although if I am going to use something balanced, basically all of my balance cables right now are 4.4 mil. So that's a bit of a bummer. And again, I feel like that is going to be a little bit disqualifying for some people. For me, as someone who prefers generally 3.5 mil, it's not disqualifying for me, but you've been warned. Okay. So that's the physical stuff. Let's dive into kind of like the software experience, what it's like to live with the Surfans F28. And like I mentioned, this is not an Android-based player, so it is using its own software. I would guess that it's using some version, like a fork of the HIby OS, but I actually don't know that. But it has a couple things in common with that make me feel like it. So the touchscreen interface and stuff is a little bit on the janky side, which is kind of typical. I feel like I generally prefer Android-based audio players because the touch controls are about as good as touch controls get. Whereas when you go with these alternative like Linux-based devices, there's always a little bit of jank in the touch. And that is still the case here. There's also some other kind of like non-Android jank that you can kind of expect. So like, for example, here we're on the home screen and like, there's not enough area on these buttons for the text, so it just kind of like scrolls, and like because they're all different lengths, they're all scrolling at different speeds, and it's just it feels janky. Obviously, it doesn't get in the way of me using the device. I know how to I can do that. It's fine, but there you go. It does come into play in a couple other spots too, but I can't even remember where they are. Maybe on like the playback screen. Oh, there is actually a funny thing that I had seen on the playback screen, although funny enough, I'm not seeing it now. How do I get that? Well, we'll see if I can get there anyway, eventually. So what else did I want to say? Here's some other jank, all right? Going to the settings. And one of the things I like to do with these players, because the battery on this thing is not fantastic. We'll talk a little bit more about the battery life in a bit, but it's not fantastic battery life. So generally with these players, I want them to go into like a standby mode automatically when I'm not using it. That'll just mean, you know, if I'm not playing it, it'll save battery life, and usually they power on and off really quickly. So that's fine for me. Like just turn yourself off when I'm not using it. This one has an option in it that I feel like is a useless option, and it was also confusing because I had it the wrong way for a while. Let's see if I can find it. I'm looking for that option. All right, here, it's this guy right here. It's the idle timer option. I would just leave that one off. The option that I used instead was standby, and I think this is functioning the way I expect. The blue LED will go off if I'm not using the player, and the battery life seems to be like the static battery life seems fine. So, but this idle timer, I thought this was how I would have the unit turn itself off automatically after, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes of not touching it, which is what I want it to do. And this will kind of do that, which is why I thought that it was doing it. But there's a couple things that are really janky about this. So one, what mode is this in right now? Like, is this enabled or not? Is this setting? Like, will it turn itself off if I don't touch it in 5 minutes? The answer is no, but I only know that because this little toggle right here, I thought that toggle turned the idle timer off, but in fact, turning the toggle on turns the idle timer off. Does that make sense? Right? Watch, if I'll turn that off and I go over here, now the idle timer is set to 5 minutes. Whereas if I turn off to on, the idle timer is off. Does that make sense? On is off. That's my point. The other thing that was pretty unintuitive is that, let's say I set this timer to, what is that, 5 minutes right now? Oh, do I have to turn it off before I can fix it? There we go. All right. If I set the timer to 5 minutes, you might intuitively think that if I'm not using the player for 5 minutes, it'll turn itself off. And yes, it will do that, but it'll also turn itself off if I am using the player for 5 minutes. In fact, it seems like I just have to interact with the player at like I have to hit a button or touch the screen, and then it will turn it, like it'll reset that 5 minute timer. But if I'm actively listening to music and that timer, the idle timer is turned on, it will still turn the power off on the unit and just turn it off like that. That's not how I expected that to work. I think maybe that's kind of functioning the way that I would expect like a sleep timer to work, right? Whereas a sleep timer, you might set 120 minutes, like 2 hours, go to bed, and then it'll turn itself off in the middle of the night. That's how I would expect that to work. I don't know what the difference between idle timer and sleep timer are. But here's my point. Leave that off, turn standby on, and you should be fine. All right, sorry. That was a bit of a side quest on Android or non-Android jank, but there you go. Okay, the plus. I did mention that this thing boots up pretty quickly. Let me show you real quick. So we're gonna turn it off. I know seeing a unit turn off and on is not the most exciting content, but This is important. This comes into play when you're using a unit daily, right? So I've turned it back on. And for me, again, that means that I don't really mind this thing turning itself off if that is the case. That said, when I have standby mode enabled, I don't need to go through this full boot up process. Standby mode doesn't actually fully power the unit off. So it seems like there's no way to fully power the unit off, at least not in a way that is usable for me. Okay. All right. We've talked a lot about the power settings here, which feels a little excessive, but I did also want to just kind of highlight I feel like some jank in the way that the music is organized. So normally when I'm looking at, the top level screen here, I might look for my music library, or I might look for like the artist navigation, because usually that's how I listen to my music, right? Is I start with the artist in mind, I'll drive in to the album, and then I'll usually listen to an album, because I'm an album guy. But how would I do that on this player? It actually took me a while to figure it out, because I would go into my music and it's got playlists and favorites and recently played, but that's not what I was looking for. Folders, you can navigate your memory card if you want to, and I guess that'll do it. But the other way that was very unintuitive is that what I'm looking for is actually under this section called playlist. This is the set of options I was expecting on the home screen, because now I can go into artists, now I can go into cigarettes after sex, find my singles, play the track I'm looking for. So the organization I'm looking for is there. It's just a little bit on the awkward side. A couple things that are missing that are fairly typical on these audio players is like there's no way for me to just play all of these albums in sequential order, which is frankly a big way that I like to listen to music. So that's a little bit of a bummer. You can see also that we've got Cigarettes After Sex up here, and The Cure is down here, alphabetized, because it thinks the is part of the name. I mean, it is part of the name, but I generally prefer The Cure to be alphabetized with the C's. But again, that's a thing that is pretty common. All right, other than that, let's see. I was going to talk about the EQ real quick. Let's see if I can even find the EQ. Where is the EQ? Because I'm on the wrong screen. All right, there is an EQ, which is cool. So you can customize the sound of your music. I think it's in here. There we go. And it has, I'll have to turn the EQ on before I can change any of the settings. It does have like some presets in here. I think, I talked about EQ recently, how these kinds of presets, in my opinion, are basically useless, but thankfully there is a custom option, which gives you, a little 10-band slider to adjust various frequencies. You can see that you've got pretty decent selection of where those sliders are at as well. Like those are generally pretty useful. So I like that. And then the other thing that was kind of nice too, this is something I think a lot of people don't keep in mind when they're playing around with EQ, but if I were to, let's say, like boost the bass, right? Let's say I boost the bass by a lot, 7 dB bass boost. To avoid clipping, you actually want to kind of reduce the sound of everything else by about 7 dB to avoid that bass boost clipping. Your speakers are really just like the digital audio is what you end up clipping. And thankfully this actually does that automatically. It'll automatically do that negative pre-gain for you, which is a nice touch. Basically, there's, as far as I could tell, no way to screw that up and make your sound awful, which is good. Okay, battery life. I promised I would talk about that. This is got a 2000 milliamp hour battery, which in a little player like this should be actually pretty plenty. I will say that the claimed battery life is not fantastic. It's about 12 hours, which is not bad, but also not fantastic. Like if you are a person like me who likes to sleep with a digital audio player, like I tried this last night, I had like 55% battery life. I woke up with it, it was dead. That is kind of a typical experience with an audio player that has under 20 hours of battery life, unfortunately. And this one at 12 hours is not fantastic. Now, we'll also note that 12 hours claimed, which seems about right, is for the single-ended. I don't know. Usually when you listen on a balance connector, you get a little bit less battery life. As someone who doesn't use balance a lot, and especially not 2.5 mil balance, I actually can't tell you how that changes the battery life, because I did do some listening, but not like enough to drain the battery. Okay, on the topic of sound, however, on the topic of listening, the DACs that are in this player are, pretty common ESS DAC. So it's got two of them because it does have balance connection. And for anyone who's interested, it is the ES9018K2M. It doesn't really mean anything to me apart from just knowing that it's a nice, reputable brand. They all, to me, sound basically the same generally. Power output on this thing is actually not bad. On single-ended, it is claimed to be 125 milliwatts of power, which is not a ton, but frankly, I find that to be plenty, even for things like the Sennheiser HD600s. And then when you use the balance connector, if you have a 2.5 mil connection, you actually get quite a bit more power, which is 400 milliwatts, that's actually kind of a lot of power, actually. The only downside is you have to go through that 2.5 to get there. As far as like my testing, right, I used the Moondrop Cosmo, which I was just looking over here to the right, which is a little bit harder to drive actually than the Sennheiser HD600, but still on 3.5 mil connection, I was perfectly happy with it. At like 75 to 80% volume, it was loud enough for me. Now, I'm not a really loud listener, so if you are a loud listener, you might run into difficulties with that same setup, the Cosmo plus this audio player. But again, if you're on the balance connection, you should be plenty fine. There were no specs in terms of the output impedance on this device, and I bring that up just because, if you're not familiar with these things, output impedance can have an effect on the sound of your headphone. It can make it bassier, it can make it brighter, and it's kind of random depending on, from model to model. And usually the effect is more noticeable on IEMs than it is on headphones, just because they're more sensitive to that kind of stuff. And usually the output impedance on these things is not very high. So there's no specs on it. What I will say is that I didn't notice this thing shifting the frequency response of my headphones really, although I did do a little bit of testing with the new Critical Cross Truth Ear Zero Blue 2, which is actually pretty sensitive to output impedance changes. And if the output impedance on this thing was remotely high, I would expect to see a bass boost, and I didn't, which is good. But interestingly, I did see a slightly counterclockwise tilted frequency response where it actually looked a little bit brighter than my normal Apple dongle source. So I think it's within the realm of like placebo, like is half a decibel. I don't think in a blind test I would be able to pick up that difference. But if you're really sensitive to that sort of stuff, or you just don't want a source that's shifting your frequency response at all, this doesn't seem purely neutral. But again, it's within the realm of placebo for me. So I'm not too concerned about it. And then the last thing I'll talk about sound quality is the noise floor, which is something that frankly I think does make a big difference with these audio players. It's like, are you hearing a hiss? And the truth is that most of the time, no. But if you are using a sensitive IEM, like I'm always use a Campfire Audio Aura as my test case, but even things like, budget KZ IEMs, a lot of the times they're super sensitive. They can pick up a hiss on audio players or like your laptop output and stuff like that. On this, I would say on the 3.5 mil connector with my Aura, again, the most sensitive IEM that I've got, it was audible. There is an audible hiss, but I wouldn't really find it distracting. It does somewhat muddy up like the blackness of the background, but I don't know, it wouldn't stop me from listening to it. However, on the balance connector, it was quite noticeable. In fact, I could hear it over the top of music. So for me, the balance connector, with a sensitive IEM, I would just say no. But generally, I would also just avoid balance connectors with sensitive IEMs. Nonetheless, people do it. So there you go. But yeah, I would only use the balance connector for headphones that are hard to drive. You're not going to hear that background hiss on those. But there you go. Okay. I don't know. I think that's frankly as much as I can tell you about the Surfans F28. Out of 5 stars, I'll give it 3. Like, it's fine. It's fine. It's not my favorite audio player, I will say though. If I'm going to spend this amount of money on an audio player, I think the HIby R3 is just quite a bit nicer. It does have some of the similar jank because this is also a non-Android based audio player. But it's just got more modern hardware. It's got the 4.4 mil connector, and I think it has less issues with the background hiss and stuff like that. So this player's fine. I do really like the physical form factor on it, actually. I will say this is one of my favorite hand-feeling audio players in a long time. But they do have a couple of things to figure out before this thing's great. Will they do it? I don't know. Stay tuned. Yeah, if you want to check this thing out, of course, I'll have it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get with the theory.